All right, today just a couple thoughts on order of effects on a pedal board. There's lots and lots and lots of resources out there on this sort of thing because there's kind of some prevailing thoughts about kind of the whole thing. And the basic premise of that is kind of like you've got effects that might be dependent on like a buffer or something. You got compressors, dirt, and then modulation and like wet effects like delay and reverb. Delay usually first, reverb usually second. So rather than rehash all that same stuff, kind of want to talk through each bit of that kind of chain that you might have and like talk about why you might decide one thing or the other. Because at the end of the day, there's not really rules about it. It's just what sounds good to you and what doesn't. And so to start from that place of just like, well, get in there and experiment and, maybe start with what's kind of conventional or recommended, but then after that, do some experimenting and use your ears and see what sounds good. But so what I hope to do is sort of give you, kind of how you might approach each part of that and why you might make a decision one way or the other. So yeah, if you have like a certain kind of fuzz pedal on your board, like older fuzzes, classic fuzzes, whatever, I would say if you have a fuzz at all, that you might want to try and put that first in your chain and just see if like the input of the fuzz seeing your guitar's actual input first in the chain before anything else makes any difference in the way your fuzz sounds. Because sometimes it will, and there's no real way to know unless the manufacturer kind of like tips you off to that, or you've heard it before and you change something and then you're like, well, my fuzz sounds wrong. Why does it sound wrong? So if you have anything that you think is older or could be affected by your guitar, kind of like it kind of seeing your guitar as the first thing it sees, mess with that first, and that might be something that you want to put first in your chain. Then you kind of come to a compressor. If you use a compressor, you can put your compressor before your overdrives, you can put it after. And the reason you might do it either way is just think about kind of the order in which it's doing things. So a compressor is going to kind of limit and compress your signal to a certain dynamic range. Maybe it's just a little, maybe it's a lot. It depends on the style of music you play. If your compressor has EQ controls, you might want to, if you don't use any of your drives always on, and you do use a compressor always on, you might kind of want to, smash and shape the sound first before you run it into everything else. So that's kind of like your bass tone that you either always use or you like it before you get into anything else. But your drive pedals are also going to compress your signal. And so what you might want instead, which happens in studio work sometimes, is you'll do whatever kind of compression you're gonna do with drives first, or your amp. Like your amp, if you set your amp to overdrive, it's gonna compress your signal naturally also. You may wanna do all that first with your drive pedals, and then coming out of all your drive section, whatever that is, then you might wanna have your compressor there, so that whatever compression happens here, it's kind of that last step of like tightening up what you want your sound to sound like. So it's worth experimenting with placing that in either place. And, it depends on how you run your compressor. If you run your compressor very lightly and it's just kind of a subtle effect, it may not make much of any audible difference where you put it in the chain. Noise is another factor. Sometimes having a compressor before or after, depending on the compressor and how you use it, like might cause unwanted noise, and it might be better to put it one place or another. So there's that. Drives, there's lots of thoughts about that. Basically, it's, are you stacking your drives together or are they all working independently? If they're all working independently and you never put more than one on at the same time, the order of them doesn't make any difference. You can put them in any order you want. If you're stacking them, there's a couple schools of thought about that too. Do you put your lowest gains first and stack your low gain pedals into your high gain ones, or do you have your high gains first, and if you stack them, put the high gain into the low gain? Low to high sort of makes logical sense because you're literally stacking one sound on top of another on top of another. So some people will only have 3 or 4 low gain drives, but they just stack them together to make it richer and more complex. There's a school of thought that says if you have a lower gain pedal, it probably has higher headroom in it. And so if you run a higher gain pedal into the lower gain pedal, that you'll get better results. Whereas if you put a low gain pedal into a high gain one that doesn't have much headroom, that it'll just kind of sound mushy and you won't really hear the character of the low one coming through. So that's something worth considering and messing with. As a general rule, kind of whatever the last thing is in your stack of pedals is going to be the thing that comes through the most prominently. So if you have a drive that has, you know, a character that you really love, you may want to try stacking other things into that drive, because that drive's character is going to come through the most because it's the last thing in the chain. So just some thoughts about drives. If you use a volume pedal, I've covered this in another video also about volume pedals, but basically if you run it before your dirt effects, then your signal's going to start cleaner and get dirtier as you ramp up. If you run it after your gains, the gain is already set. So all the volume is doing is how loud is that gain sound. And so that might depend on kind of where you want it in your chain. After that, we get into modulation. You get into, your, chorus, your delay, your reverb, your, who knows, flangers, phasers, pitch shifters, octaves, whatever. I suppose octaves are worth mentioning. There's some octave pedals that like track better, like they stay with your quick picking of strings if they're closer to the front of your signal chain, like closer to your guitar. And that's kind of like all this stuff is just kind of a preference thing. Like, do you feel like it keeps up okay if you overdrive your signal first before you go into your octave? That probably goes with everything else. I'd say these days, especially if you're thinking about running a stereo rig, you're gonna want all of your stereo things last in the chain, because ultimately you need a stereo pedal of some kind to, be able to create two outputs from one input. So you'll need those to be last in the chain. And a lot of times it makes more sense, that you want kind of your signal to kind of do all its other stuff with compression and dirt and all that stuff, and then you kind of add your ambience on the end of it. But there's still kind of like the last effect is the most prominent rule to some extent. Again, it depends on your ears, but so if you run, let's say, a chorus and a delay and a reverb or whatever, if you put the chorus last, like the chorus is going to be, arguably more prominent there. But what's coming into the chorus is going to be delayed and reverbed first. And so it may not be like as present of a signal that goes there, but you might like that effect. Or like if you don't use a ton of reverb, but you love delay, then maybe you would want your reverb first. It's just that the signal then being fed to the delay is reverbed first. So the whole general idea of like chorus first, then delay, then reverb makes sense in theory, and it works for, probably the majority of people, but you just don't have to do it that way. If you really love one effect, you may experiment with putting that at the very end of your chain. And also, pedal order is a great way to kind of shake up the way that you do things. If you're stuck in a rut creatively or something, it could be nice to just flip things around and be forced to adapt to something new. Or if like you're in a studio or writing environment, changing around the order of that stuff might make stuff sound differently or force you to be more creative or like make you think more creatively about something. And then buffer is kind of another thing. I think I did a video on this like years ago, but basically a buffer is like, will kind of strengthen the signal that's kind of coming through your whole chain so that by the time it comes out the other end, it doesn't sound like it's lost something. It's usually high end that it loses. Like if you go through a whole lot of effects or a long change and there's nothing to buffer that signal or like strengthen it, you'll feel like you lose some high end. That really only matters if you feel like it does. Like if you've changed your rig and you lost something, or you're constantly fighting with like, my tone's not clear, like I keep having to crank treble on my amps or whatever to get it that way, you may investigate that. And it's pretty easy to test. You just kind of run your guitar straight to either your amp or your cab sim or whatever you're using and just compare that, maybe even record it really fast, that signal, then run it through your whole signal chain of pedals with all of them turned off, and see what the difference is. Like there's probably going to be a difference because, you can't run through a bunch of effects without having any difference in the signal. It's just whether or not it matters to you. then you might want to add a buffer somewhere in the chain. And experiment with that too. Put it at the end, put it in the middle, put it at the front. See how it changes the way your other pedals interact and all that stuff. So hopefully that helps at least get you, thinking about why you might make a decision at each point in the chain instead of like, this is the way you have to do it and you should do it, So hopefully that helps. Hit with questions in the comments if you've got them, and I will see you later.